Over 1 month into the war in West Asia, and there is no definite end in sight even now. Month 2 has already started. US says the war is on schedule, while Israel says they are halfway there. But even as they claim success, the war goals seem to be changing. Yet again, US President Trump claims that the US is in talks with a more reasonable regime in Iran to end the war, but issued a new warning over the Strait of Hormuz. He said that the US would obliterate power plants, oil wells and key oil export hubs of Kharg Island if a deal is not reached soon and this strait is not opened. Now, that's the last statement which came out from Donald Trump. But even as he made these threats, yet again, the Wall Street Journal reported that the US president had told aides that he is willing to end the military campaign even if the Strait of Hormuz remains largely closed. Now, this contradicts his own post on social media just hours before this report surfaced. The report, citing officials, said that he may plan a complex operation to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, perhaps at a later date, but not now. And this stand contrasts with what Trump had earlier claimed. Listen to this.
What about the Strait of Hormuz? Who's going to be in control of that?
That'll be opened very soon if this works.
How soon? And who's in control of it? Will Iran still be able to control the flow of oil?
Be jointly controlled.
By who?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be in
Me
control
and the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is, whoever the next Ayatollah. Look, and there'll also be a form of a very serious form of a regime change.
Now, when asked about the Wall Street report, the White House referred to comments made by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who told Al Jazeera that the strait would be open one way or another after the US military operation. Rubio also said that regime change is not an objective of the current military operation. But he suggested that the US would welcome political change in Iran. And before I go further into this report, let me quickly bring to you the quote from Donald Trump on the day this war was started. This is what Donald Trump said: "We will measure our success by the wars we end." And he also mentioned that this is the only time that the people of Iran have to take over the government. These were statements on the first day of the war. Well, Rubio also suggested that the US would be willing to play a role if political change became possible in Iran. During the interview, Rubio outlined the military objectives Washington is trying to achieve. These objectives are the destruction of Iranian Air Force, the destruction of their navy, reduction in the number of missile launchers, and destroying missile and drone manufacturing factories. Now, coincidentally, all these objectives that he now mentions are the achievements that US has had in terms of diminishing Iranian military capabilities so far. Rubio's statement echoes something President Trump has said at the start of the war. Now listen to this.
Our objectives are clear. First, we're destroying Iran's missile capabilities. Second, we're annihilating their navy. Third, we're ensuring that the world's #1 sponsor of terror can never obtain a nuclear weapon. And finally, we're ensuring that the Iranian regime cannot continue to arm, fund, and direct terrorist armies outside of their borders.
Donald Trump already signaled that the goal of a regime change may have turned into a goal of leadership change. Trump has said that he is negotiating with elements of what could become a new regime, suggesting that regime change has already been accomplished in Iran.
I think we'll make a deal with them, pretty sure. Whether it's possible, we won't. But we've had regime change, if you look already, because the one regime was decimated, destroyed, they're all dead. The next regime is mostly dead. And the third regime, we're dealing with different people than anybody's dealt with before. It's a whole different group of people. So I would consider that regime change.
Hours after Rubio's interview, the White House listed slightly different list objectives. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that the objectives of the war were to destroy the Iranian Navy, destroyed their ballistic missiles, dismantled their missile and drone production infrastructure, significantly weakened their proxies, and preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. Rubio had made no mention of Iran's support for proxies or its nuclear program. And these are statements coming hours away from each other, as US still maintains that their objectives are clear. Asked about the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, Levitt said that the administration is working towards it, but then also added, and here is where it starts to become trickier. She said that it is not a core objective of this war. Now listen to this.
One way or another, Iran will no longer have the credible ability to threaten the United States or our allies, which is, of course, the overall objective and mission the president set out when he launched Operation Epic Fury.
All right. Now, to disseminate, to decipher what is really going on, what does the US really plan to do in this war? For more on this, I'm now being joined by Lynn O'Donnell, journalist and author. Lynn, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for making time for us. Let's quickly go over and give me a few seconds. Let me give more context to our viewers. There was initially a threat from Donald Trump towards Iran saying, I am giving you 48 hours, open up the Strait of Hormuz. Hours before that 48-hour window was about to expire, he said, we are already in talks with Iran. Now I'm giving you 5 more days, no more attacks on your energy infrastructure, open the Strait of Hormuz. All this while, Iran says we're not having any talks with the US. Then at the end of that 5 days, he says, I'm giving you another 10-day window. Now that 10-day window calculatively ends on the 6th of April. And now, as we're approaching that date, a report suggests that Trump is mulling exiting the Strait of Hormuz or exiting this war without opening up the strait. And now the White House says that opening up the Strait of Hormuz is not part of our core objective. So while the core objectives remain a question, I wanted to understand, is US looking for an honorable exit out of this war by changing the objectives, mentioning what they've achieved so that they can say, we got what we wanted, now we're out?
Hi, Shivan. Thank you for having me. Honourable, well, there's a word to throw around. I do think that the American side has pretty much abrogated responsibility for reopening the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's only achievable in theory anyway, and that theory is linked to escalation, which is essentially the war that Donald Trump's America does not want to have. So what matters here, I think, when we're looking at the Strait of Hormuz is just exactly what Iran has been able to achieve, which is essentially disruption of the global economy. It's no longer a regional disruptor, it's a global disruptor. And no matter what the Americans do, short of boots on the ground or an escalation of some sort, Iran still has the capability of disrupting the global economy by targeting ships, laying mines, and stopping ships from going through the Strait of Hormuz to take oil, much needed oil, to markets in Asia and beyond. So, your question is, what's going on? The fact is that nobody knows what's going on, but what Donald Trump and his team seem to be doing is backing away from their earlier objectives, regime change, as you showed Donald Trump initially wanted, in order to change the parameters of the war and declare victory, even though, the word itself is pretty elastic at the moment.
Lynn, Donald Trump has already established that the US has won. He's not shied away from saying it out loud. We've won and we're winning so well. All of that is done. Then come the threats, and then Iran does not submit to any of it. And now finally there are some kind of hints of an exit, saying and suggesting that we've already achieved our war objectives. But let me quickly come back to Iran. And you mentioned that the Strait of Hormuz and the global impact it's having. The war, US has its points saying we've largely diminished Iran's military capabilities, but a counter to that is, do you feel Iran is more emboldened now after this war, knowing exactly what kind of impact they can have across the world with the Strait of Hormuz in their ambit?
Yeah, I think that's really the point, isn't it, Siobhan? Iran has demonstrated that it can hurt the global economy without defeating the US militarily. And that's the nub here. It can disrupt 20% of global oil flows through Hormuz, and it's already caused the largest oil market disruption in modern history and sharp price spikes and global economic shock. And that's strategic leverage that Iran has in this conflict. And more importantly, Iran has also shown that it can absorb strikes, it can keep operating under pressure, and the United States and Israel are both exerting extreme pressure on Iran. But it's also shown that it can escalate economically without escalating into a full war. So what emboldens them? The US signalling no regime change, a limited timeline, a willingness to end the war without reopening the Strait of Hormuz. What that tells Tehran is to hold out because you've got leverage here.
Also, Lynn, let me quickly come to some more discrepancies coming from within the Trump camp. If it's not bad enough that Iran is saying that we're not in talks and US is saying we are continuing the talks, there are discrepancies within the Trump camp where Trump says we've already won the war. Marco Rubio says a couple of weeks more. JD Vance says it won't last 1 year or 2 years. And all these statements coming within days of each other. What does one make of what's really going on?
Well, what's going on? Nobody knows what's going on. I mean, senior officials of the Pentagon have been asked that in congressional committee hearings, what the hell is going on? And nobody can answer coherently or cohesively simply because everybody has a different message. As you say, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is saying regime change isn't part of the equation anymore. Donald Trump is saying, well, we're on to our third regime here. Betraying a complete lack of understanding of how the Iranian regime is layered and splayed. And Pete Hegseth, who just wants to bomb things and blow things up without seeming to have any strategic understanding of what's going on. So there is no cohesive message. Again, this plays into Iran's leverage. They know what they're doing. They've learned over the course of the past few weeks what they can do and what they can achieve. And they've essentially found out that they can bring the global economy to its knees. And that's where their power over the United States, without being militarily stronger, lies.
Lynn, thanks so much for joining us. And I understand that it's really a head scratcher at this point. What's really going on within the Trump camp? What's going on between US and Iran? Which parties are involved? Are there any talks taking place? Who's in charge? But Iran, as of now, regardless of how many heads have been eliminated from their leadership, they still seem to be carrying out a collegiate approach towards this war. They say we're going to do something, and that's exactly then what they're doing. As far as the US is concerned, it's difficult to assess what they say they're going to do and then what eventually happens, what are the objectives. A lot of questions. There would be more to discuss. Look forward to speaking with you again. That was Lynn O'Donnell joining us.
Thanks, Shiva.